For decades, the Queen's most trusted archivists believed they had uncovered every secret she left behind, every letter catalogued, every document sealed with precision, every private instruction carefully protected from history's reach. But then, deep beneath the oldest wing of Windsor, a discovery shattered everything they thought they knew. Because what they found wasn't just hidden, it was deliberately concealed, and its existence would devastate King Charles in ways no one could have predicted. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began as nothing more than routine preservation. The royal archivists were performing a task they had performed countless times before maintaining the structural integrity of history itself. They were the silent guardians of memory, entrusted with protecting centuries of royal decisions, private thoughts, and irreversible truths. Their work was meticulous, disciplined, and deeply respectful of the weight it carried. Nothing surprised them anymore. Or at least, that's what they believed, until one of them noticed something that didn't belong. It was subtle, almost invisible. A structural reinforcement beneath a forgotten corridor that did not align with any architectural records. At first, it was dismissed as a construction anomaly, the kind that occasionally surfaced in buildings as old and modified as Windsor Castle. But curiosity, once ignited, has a dangerous way of demanding answers, and when they investigated further, the truth began to unfold with terrifying clarity. Behind that reinforced section was a door, not a symbolic door, not a ceremonial one, a real physical vault door, unregistered, unacknowledged. And most disturbing of all, unaccounted for in every official palace blueprint ever recorded. The archivists froze. This wasn't a mistake. It couldn't be. Every inch of Windsor had been documented, studied, restored, and preserved over generations. Nothing existed without purpose, and yet here it was, staring back at them in silent defiance of everything they thought they knew. The metal itself bore the quiet authority of age, its locking mechanisms belonging to an era far older than recent palace renovations. This wasn't new. This had been placed here deliberately, decades ago, possibly longer. Someone had built this vault not to protect history, but to hide it. But it wasn't the door itself that shook them. It was what they saw engraved into its surface. The Queen's insignia, not the public version, not the ceremonial crest seen on official documents. This was different. This was her private authorization seal, the one used only for matters of the highest personal significance. The meaning was unmistakable. This vault had existed under her command, her knowledge, her will. And suddenly, the archivists weren't just historians anymore. They were witnesses to something deeply personal, something she never intended to be found. The room filled with silence, heavy, suffocating silence, because the implications were impossible to ignore. The Queen had hidden something beneath her own home, something she had never disclosed, not to advisors, not to palace officials, not even to her own son. The realization struck with quiet horror. This vault had not been forgotten. It had been protected by secrecy itself. And in that moment, routine preservation became an emergency. Notifications were sent. Authority figures were alerted. Protocols shifted instantly. Access was restricted. Conversations lowered into whispers. No one wanted to be the first to say what everyone was thinking, because if the Queen had gone to such extraordinary lengths to conceal this vault, then whatever was inside wasn't just important. It was dangerous. Fear doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives as understanding, a slow, creeping awareness that something irreversible has already begun. And as word reached the highest levels of the royal household, the atmosphere changed in ways no one could explain. Tension replaced certainty. Confidence gave way to unease. Because this wasn't just a hidden vault. This was a decision made by the Queen herself. A decision that had waited silently beneath Windsor Castle, untouched, unchallenged, and unseen, waiting for the moment when it could no longer remain hidden. But while the discovery alone was shocking, nothing could prepare the palace or King Charles for the truth. Waiting inside that sealed chamber, Queen Elizabeth was known for her discipline, her composure, and her absolute devotion to duty. But behind the crown was a woman who understood betrayal, loyalty, and the fragile balance of legacy. She planned everything, including what would happen long after she was gone. And now, with the discovery of a vault she never spoke of, one terrifying question emerged. What did the Queen know that made her create a secret she trusted no one else to see? To understand the vault, one must first understand the woman who ordered its creation. Queen Elizabeth did not believe in chance. She believed in preparation, in foresight, in the quiet power of decisions made long before anyone realized they would matter. Throughout her reign, she carried the weight of history not just on her shoulders, but in her hands. She documented everything not for public record, but for personal clarity. Her private writings were never careless. They were deliberate, calculated, and deeply revealing of a mind that never stopped evaluating the future. While official archives reflected the monarchy's public face, her personal records reflected something far more fragile: her fears, her doubts, and her determination to protect something greater than herself. As the decades passed, subtle changes began to shape her inner world. The monarchy, once defined by stability, began to experience fractures that could not be ignored. Emotional tensions within the family, shifting loyalties, moments that forced her to confront the uncomfortable truth that legacy was not guaranteed by tradition alone. It had to be protected, guarded, preserved with intention. Those closest to her began to notice a shift not in her public behavior, but in her private focus. She became quieter about certain matters, more selective with trust. Conversations that once flowed freely became measured, controlled, because she understood something others didn't yet see. She understood that the greatest threat to the monarchy would never come from outside. It would come from within. It was during these final decades that the protocols surrounding her private preservation began to change. New instructions were issued not publicly, but quietly, carefully. Archivists were given orders that did not follow traditional channels. Certain materials were separated from the official historical record, preserved under her direct authority alone. These were not ceremonial gestures, they were safeguards. Because the Queen was no longer thinking only as a monarch, she was thinking as a protector of continuity itself. She knew that once she was gone, interpretation of her legacy would no longer be hers to control. And that loss of control was something she refused to accept without preparation. The vault was born from that realization, constructed not as a symbol, but as a solution. Its existence bypassed normal palace transparency, known only to those she personally trusted to carry out her instructions without question. It was never intended to be discovered by accident. It was intended to remain dormant until the moment its purpose became unavoidable. Because this vault was not about preserving the past, it was about shaping the future. Every document placed inside was chosen with precision. Every omission intentional, every inclusion meaningful. It reflected not just what she wanted remembered, but what she wanted protected. In her final years, the Queen understood something with devastating clarity. Legacy is not defined at the moment of death. It is defined by what survives afterward, by what remains when emotion fades and only structure remains. She knew the monarchy would face moments of uncertainty, moments when personal relationships would collide with institutional responsibility, and she knew that in those moments silent guidance would be more powerful than spoken instruction. The vault became her final act of leadership, her final assertion of control over a future she would never personally witness. It was her way of ensuring that even in absence, her judgment would endure. Because she was not preparing for her own ending, she was preparing for what would happen after, preparing for the moment when her silence would speak louder than her voice ever could. And when King Charles was informed that this secret vault existed under his own feet, the emotional weight of his mother's silence would hit him harder than anyone expected. King Charles had waited his entire life to inherit the crown, but no one warned him he would inherit his mother's secrets too. When palace officials delivered the news of the hidden vault, the room reportedly fell silent, not because of what they knew, but because of what they didn't. Because Charles wasn't just facing a discovery, he was confronting a question that would haunt him instantly. Why would his own mother hide something from him? At first, he did what he had always done when faced with uncertainty. He relied on logic, structure, protocol. The monarchy was built on systems designed to prevent surprises. Every document catalogued, every decision archived, every royal instruction preserved with obsessive precision. Charles had lived inside that system his entire life. He understood its order, its predictability, its quiet reassurance. So when he was first informed about the existence of an undisclosed vault beneath Windsor, his instinct was not fear, but disbelief. There had to be an explanation, a procedural oversight, a forgotten structural addition, something rational, something harmless, because the alternative was unthinkable. But the alternative quickly became reality. When archivists confirmed the authentication markings, everything changed. This vault had not been misplaced. It had not been forgotten. It had been created deliberately under the Queen's direct authority. His mother's authority. That confirmation didn't just introduce a secret, it destroyed the illusion that he had fully understood her. For a brief moment, Charles was no longer king. He was a son confronted by the possibility that his mother had chosen silence over trust. Those present would later recall the stillness that followed. Not anger, not confusion, something heavier, something quieter. A silence filled with realization, because silence, in that moment, was the only possible response. He did not ask immediate questions, perhaps because he already feared the answers. All his life, Charles had prepared himself to continue her legacy, to uphold her decisions, to honor her judgment. He had studied her discipline, admired her restraint, and trusted her wisdom. But now he faced something he had never prepared for: the possibility that she had made decisions without him. Decisions that extended beyond his knowledge, beyond his influence, beyond his reach. It created a fracture inside him, one that could not be resolved through authority or duty. Because this was not a matter of governance, it was a matter of trust, and with that fracture came fear. Fear of what the vault might contain. Fear of what it might reveal about relationships he believed were secure. Fear that his mother had seen something he had not, anticipated something he had not, prepared for something he did not yet understand. The implications reached far beyond history. They reached into the present, into his reign, into his marriage. Because Charles knew one truth above all others: the Queen never acted without purpose. If she had created this vault, it was because she believed it was necessary. And that belief carried weight that could not be ignored. As preparations began to open the vault, the emotional tension surrounding Charles intensified. Every moment of waiting deepened the psychological burden. Every answered question strengthened the quiet dread forming beneath his composure. He was no longer waiting for discovery. He was waiting for judgment. Judgment from the one person whose opinion had shaped his entire life. And perhaps for the first time since ascending the throne, Charles understood that being king did not protect him from the emotional consequences of his mother's final decisions. It only ensured that he would have to face them alone, because whatever waited behind that door had been placed there intentionally, not by history, not by accident, but by her. But when the vault was finally opened, what lay inside would reveal not just secrets, but a devastating exclusion no one saw coming. As the vault doors slowly opened, centuries of royal tradition seemed to hold their breath. Inside were documents, sealed envelopes, and personal items carefully preserved by the Queen herself, each one a message, each one a decision, each one a piece of her final will F or the monarchy. But as archivists reviewed the contents, one horrifying truth emerged. Among every instruction, every designation, every symbol of trust, one name was nowhere to be found. At first, the contents appeared exactly as one might expect from a monarch who had spent her life safeguarding continuity. The materials were arranged with unmistakable precision, not chaotic, not emotional, intentional. Every envelope carried meaning beyond its paper. Every page represented authority extending beyond her lifetime. These were not memories. These were instructions, clear, deliberate, and final. There were designations reinforcing the structure of succession, affirmations of responsibility directed toward individuals she believed would carry the monarchy forward. The Queen, even in silence, was still guiding the institution she had protected for over 70 years. And in doing so, she revealed exactly where her trust remained. Archivists moved carefully through each document, aware that they were not simply reviewing history, they were witnessing it evolve. Personal letters emerged, addressed in her unmistakable voice, words that carried both warmth and weight. These were not public statements, they were private affirmations. She acknowledged sacrifice, loyalty, endurance. She named those she believed would preserve the monarchy's moral center. Each message strengthened the invisible architecture of future authority. Each instruction quietly ensured that the monarchy would remain anchored to the principles she valued most. It was not dramatic. It was something far more powerful. It was controlled permanence. But as the review continued, an absence began to take shape. At first, it was subtle, easy to dismiss. A missing reference, an omitted acknowledgement. But then, it became undeniable. Across every document reinforcing legacy authority, across every symbolic transfer of ceremonial continuity, across every written affirmation of future institutional trust, Camilla's name did not appear. Not once, not in passing, not indirectly, not symbolically. The silence was absolute, and that silence spoke louder than any written instruction ever could. The archivists felt it immediately, not confusion, recognition, because omission, in a structure this deliberate, was never accidental. The Queen had not forgotten, she had decided. She had constructed a future in which Camilla did not occupy the same symbolic permanence as others. This was not an emotional oversight, it was a structural reality. The implications spread through the room like quiet shock. The Queen had drawn a line not publicly, not loudly, but permanently. She had reinforced continuity, but she had done so with boundaries that could not be ignored. Contained within the vault were clear reinforcements of succession itself. Charles remained the rightful king. That had never been in question. But surrounding that continuity were layers of symbolic authority, ceremonial roles, legacy protections, institutional affirmations that defined how influence would endure beyond the crown itself. And within those layers, Camilla did not exist. The Queen had preserved the monarchy's future while quietly redefining its emotional architecture. She had protected the crown, but she had done so on her own terms. The realization left those present shaken in ways they could not express openly. Because this was more than history, this was active power extending beyond death. The Queen's silence was not passive. It was directive. Every omission carried intention. Every preserved instruction carried finality. This vault was not just a collection of documents. It was her final act of leadership, her final assertion of control over how the monarchy would endure. And now, that control had resurfaced in a moment. NTT no one could reverse. Immediate containment protocols were enforced. Access restricted, information sealed, because the consequences of this revelation were not theoretical. They were immediate, political, emotional, institutional. This discovery could not simply be archived. It had to be managed, carefully, quietly, because the Queen had left behind something more powerful than instruction. She had left behind a reality that could not be undone. And at the center of that reality stood King Charles, a man who had spent his entire life preparing to inherit his mother's crown, but never imagining he would inherit her final judgment, because what she had preserved in silence was no longer hidden. It was active, it was real, and it was waiting for him. But the emotional devastation this revelation caused would not remain confined to the vault. It would reach directly into the heart of King Charles himself. For King Charles, the revelation wasn't political, it was personal. This wasn't just about Camilla's exclusion. It was about trust, about loyalty, about his mother's final judgment. And as he reviewed the contents himself, the truth became unavoidable. The Queen had made a choice, a permanent one, and now Charles was forced to face the possibility that the woman who defined his life had left behind a message he was never meant to ignore. He did not approach the vault as a king. He approached it as a son, searching for understanding. Behind closed doors, removed from advisors, removed from ceremony, he confronted the reality his mother had constructed without him. The documents were placed before him not as suggestions, but as declarations. Each page carried the unmistakable weight of her authority. Each instruction reinforced the future she had envisioned. And as his eyes moved across the words she had chosen so carefully, the emotional distance between them became impossible to deny. This was not simply legacy. This was intention, and intention carried meaning that could not be softened or explained away. Those closest to him would later describe a shift, not dramatic, not outward, but unmistakable. Charles became quieter, more withdrawn. The composure he had mastered over decades of preparation began to fracture beneath the pressure of what he now understood. Because this was not about what she had included. It was about what she had left out. Her silence regarding Camilla was not accidental. It was deliberate, and that deliberate silence forced Charles into a psychological conflict he could not escape. He loved his wife. He had fought for her place beside him. He had endured decades of scrutiny, judgment, and resistance to secure her role within the monarchy. And now, he faced the unbearable possibility that his mother had never fully accepted what he had spent his life defending. It created a quiet storm inside him, a storm defined not by anger, but by grief. Grief for the realization that love and duty had never existed as separate forces in his life. They had always been intertwined, and now they were colliding in ways that threatened to tear him apart. Because honoring the Queen's final instructions meant acknowledging her authority, even in absence. It meant respecting decisions she had made with clarity and conviction. That doing so would also force him to confront what those decisions implied, that she had envisioned a monarchy that could endure without Camilla's symbolic permanence, that she had drawn boundaries he had never anticipated, and that those boundaries still existed, unchallenged beneath his crown. The psychological burden of that inheritance was immense. Charles had waited his entire life to lead, but leadership had never felt like this. This was not empowerment, this was responsibility without escape. He had inherited not only the throne, but the consequences of choices he did not make, choices he could not undo without undermining the very institution he was sworn to protect. It forced him to confront an impossible question: was he first a husband or first a king? And in the monarchy, there was never room for uncertainty. Every decision shaped history. Every silence carried consequence. Slowly, a realization began to settle within him. His mother had not simply prepared the monarchy for transition. She had prepared it for survival. Survival independent of emotion, independent of personal attachment, independent of anything that could weaken its continuity. She had placed the institution above everything else, even above the choices of her own son. And now, Charles stood at the center of that reality, carrying the unbearable weight of knowing that whatever he chose next would not simply define his reign, it would define how history remembered him. Because for the first time since ascending the throne, Charles understood something with devastating clarity. The crown did not protect him from his mother's judgment. It ensured he would live beneath it forever. But Charles wasn't the only one affected, because once word of the vault began quietly spreading, the entire palace atmosphere began to shift. Secrets inside palaces never stay buried forever, and as whispers of the Queen's vault began circulating among senior royal figures, tensions erupted behind closed doors. People chose sides, loyalties were questioned, and the realization spread quickly: this wasn't just a private matter anymore. This was a power shift. Because if the Queen herself had excluded Camilla, it meant the future of royal authority might already be quietly changing. At first, the information moved the way dangerous truths always do, carefully, quietly, passed between individuals who understood the consequences of even acknowledging it aloud. No announcements were made, no formal discussions recorded. But within the palace, awareness began to spread, like a silent current beneath still water. Senior advisors, archivists, and trusted royal staff found themselves confronting a reality that forced them to rethink everything they believed about the monarchy's future. Because the Queen had not simply left behind instructions, she had left behind intention, and intention carried power that extended beyond her lifetime. Those who had spent decades protecting the monarchy understood immediately what this meant. The Queen's exclusion of Camilla was not a moment of emotion. It was a structural decision. It reshaped how influence would endure. It quietly altered the invisible hierarchy that defined the monarchy's internal balance. And once that understanding took hold, perception began to shift. Camilla was still queen. The title remained intact, But titles alone had never defined true authority within the royal institution. Authority came from continuity, from symbolic permanence, from being embedded into the monarchy's future in ways that could not be undone. And now, that permanence had been called into question. The emotional impact rippled through private interactions. Conversations became cautious, measured. Words once spoken freely were now weighed against invisible consequences, because everyone understood that the Queen's final decisions had created an unspoken divide, not visible, not acknowledged publicly, but deeply felt. Those closest to Charles struggled to navigate the delicate balance between loyalty to him and reverence for the Queen's legacy, because the two were no longer perfectly aligned. And that misalignment introduced uncertainty into a system that depended entirely on stability. Charles himself felt the shift more than anyone, not because others treated him differently, but because he could sense the unspoken awareness surrounding him. The knowledge that everyone now understood something deeply personal about his reign, something he himself had never anticipated. It isolated him in ways power could not protect him from. Because leadership, at its highest level, often meant carrying burdens no one else could share. He remained king, but beneath that title, he was a man navigating the emotional consequences of a decision he did not make. Behind closed doors, palace leadership faced an impossible challenge: containment, not of the vault itself, but of its meaning. Because if the Queen's exclusion of Camilla became public knowledge, the consequences would extend far beyond personal relationships. It would invite questions about legitimacy, about continuity, about the monarchy's internal unity, questions that could destabilize public confidence in ways no one could predict. Strategies were discussed in whispers, protocols reviewed, access to vault information restricted further, not out of deception but out of survival. Because the monarchy did not simply exist on tradition, it existed on belief. The belief that its structure was unshakable, that its continuity was certain, that its authority remained unified. And now, that certainty had been quietly fractured by the Queen herself. Her final act had introduced a truth that could not be undone, a truth that forced those within the palace to confront a future shaped not by what was said, but by what had been deliberately left unsaid. And as this silent realignment continued beneath the surface, one reality became impossible to ignore. The Queen had spoken through her silence. She had defined the future without explanation. And now, everyone inside the palace was waiting. Waiting not for answers, but for Charles. And while the palace struggled to maintain control, one question loomed, larger than all the others: what would Charles do next? For years, Camilla believed she had finally secured her place beside Charles, not just as his wife, but as queen. But nothing could prepare her for the moment she learned the truth. Because this wasn't public criticism, this wasn't media speculation, this was something far worse. This was the silent judgment of the one woman whose approval defined everything. And now, Camilla was forced to confront a reality she never imagined possible. The information did not reach her through announcement or confrontation. It arrived quietly, carefully, delivered with the kind of restraint reserved for truths too heavy to carry openly. At first, there was disbelief. Not denial, but disbelief, because Camilla had endured too much, sacrificed too much, and waited too long to believe that her place could still be uncertain. She had stood beside Charles through years of resistance, through public scrutiny that never truly disappeared, through the slow, painful process of acceptance that had taken decades to earn. She believed the chapter had ended. She believed she had finally crossed the invisible line that separated exclusion from belonging. But now, the Queen's silence had drawn that line again. It was not what was written that wounded her most, it was what was missing. There were no accusations, no condemnations, no rejection stated in words. Only absence, a deliberate omission that could not be explained away. And in that omission, Camilla faced something more devastating than criticism. She faced irrelevance in the Queen's final vision of the monarchy. It forced her to question everything she believed she had secured, not her title but her permanence. Because titles could be granted, they could be defended. But legacy was different. Legacy was chosen, and the Queen had chosen carefully. Emotionally, The impact was immediate, not expressed publicly, not spoken aloud, but deeply felt. Camilla had spent years building her place within the institution, slowly transforming perception, slowly earning acceptance that once seemed impossible. She had adapted, endured, persisted. And now she was forced to confront the possibility that acceptance had never been complete. That even at the very end, the Queen had drawn boundaries that no amount of time could erase. Between her and Charles, the silence grew heavier. It was not conflict in the traditional sense. There were no arguments, no declarations of blame, but there was something far more painful: shared understanding without resolution. Charles carried the burden of his mother's decision. Camilla carried the burden of being excluded from it, and neither could change what had already been sealed. It introduced a quiet distance between them, not of love but of emotional reality, because Charles was now bound to honor a legacy that did not fully include the woman he loved, and Camilla was forced to live within that contradiction. Within the palace itself, the shift became impossible to ignore. Nothing official changed, protocol remained intact, titles remained unchanged, but perception had evolved. Relationships subtly adjusted, conversations grew more measured. The unspoken authority that once surrounded Camilla now carried an invisible fragility, not because anyone had challenged her openly, but because everyone understood the truth the Queen had left behind. Authority within the monarchy was not defined only by position, it was defined by permanence. And permanence had been quietly denied. For Camilla, the psychological consequences ran deeper than any public controversy she had ever faced. Public criticism could be endured, it could be dismissed, it could be overcome. But this was different, this was final, this was the voice of the only figure whose judgment could never be overturned. The Queen's decision existed beyond debate, beyond revision, beyond appeal. It could not be argued with. It could only be lived with. And in that realization, Camilla faced the most painful truth of all. She had become Queen, but she had not become inevitable. But the final and most terrifying question remained unanswered. What would the monarchy become now that the Queen's secret had finally been revealed? In the end, the Queen's vault wasn't just about exclusion. It was about control, about legacy, about ensuring the monarchy would survive exactly as she believed it should. And now, long after her passing, her final decision was still shaping the future. Because even in death, she had left behind something stronger than authority. She had left behind certainty. And for King Charles, that certainty would define the rest of his reign. The vault was never simply a collection of preserved documents. It was something far more profound. It was a declaration of belief, a final reinforcement of the values the Queen had spent her entire life defending. She had understood something few others ever could, that the monarchy's greatest strength was not its visibility, but its continuity, and continuity required protection, not just from external threats, but from emotional vulnerability within. The vault revealed that her ultimate priority had never been personal comfort or temporary peace. It had always been survival. Survival of the institution, survival of its meaning, survival of the crown itself, regardless of who wore it or who stood beside it. For Charles, this realization did not arrive as a moment of clarity. It arrived as a slow, unavoidable acceptance. He could not challenge her. He could not undo her decisions. He could not erase what she had chosen to preserve, because her authority did not end with her life. It stayed, and it did beyond it, shaping his reign in ways he could neither escape nor fully control. He had inherited the throne, but he had also inherited her silence. And within that silence was a message that would follow him for the rest of his days. Not spoken, not explained, but undeniable. This marked the beginning of a new psychological era within the monarchy. An era defined not by public declarations, but by internal awareness. Everyone within the palace understood that something fundamental had shifted. Legitimacy was no longer defined solely by title or ceremony. It was defined by alignment with the Queen's final vision. Her decisions had quietly redrawn the emotional boundaries of authority. They had reshaped how permanence itself would be understood. Because permanence, as she had demonstrated, was not granted automatically. It was chosen carefully, and once chosen, it could never be reversed. Charles carried that understanding with him in every decision he made. It followed him in moments of solitude. It lingered behind every public appearance, every private conversation, every ceremonial act that reinforced his position. He was king, but he was also the son of a monarch whose influence had not faded. Her presence remained not physically, but structurally. Her judgment lived on in the systems she had shaped. Her priorities lived on in the future she had already secured. And Charles, despite his authority, now ruled within a framework she had finalized long before he ascended the throne. There was no rebellion against it, no dramatic rejection, only acceptance, because Charles understood something that few others ever would. His role was not to redefine the monarchy according to his own emotional needs. His role was to preserve what had been entrusted to him, and that trust came with weight. It came with sacrifice. It came with the quiet understanding that leadership of 10 meant carrying decisions that were never yours to make. The monarchy itself moved forward, but it did so differently. Beneath the ceremonies and traditions, beneath the continuity presented to the world, there existed a deeper awareness. The Queen's final act had ensured that her influence would endure beyond memory. She had not needed to speak publicly. She had not needed to justify her choices. She had trusted that the structure she left behind would speak for itself. And it did, because legacy was never about control in the present. It was about certainty in the future. Charles would forever stand as both beneficiary and witness to that certainty. His reign would not be defined solely by his own actions, but by the invisible architecture his mother had left behind, an architecture built not from stone or ceremony, but from decisions made in silence. Decisions that shaped destiny without ever needing to be explained. And in that silence, the monarchy found its future, not fragile, not uncertain, but exactly as she had intended. Because in the monarchy, crowns are inherited, but trust is earned. And sometimes, even kings must live with secrets they were never meant to change. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.